Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Hoş geldiniz. My name is Bülent Atalay. I'm the president of the Ataturk Society of America, consisting of individuals who are dedicated to promoting the ideals of Atatürk, founded by Hüdayi and Mirat Yavalar 21 years ago, in 1995. The society, based in Washington, organizes lectures, panel discussions. It's given awards and scholarships. And of course, 3 years ago, in 2013, it commissioned the erection of the statue at Sheridan Circle, that beautiful bronze statue, which I hope will last for 1,000 years. In a few minutes, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Burak Şahin, who will be the moderator. Meanwhile, I'll say just a few words. I have an English friend. He's quite elderly. He's 90 years old. He's very famous. He wrote the music, the lyrics for Les Miserables. We see eye to eye on virtually everything, in politics, in religion, in philosophy, and in science. A few years ago, he sent me a book by the English writer, the late English writer, Christopher Hitchens. In one account, he recounts an experience he had in Northern Ireland. He's walking around the streets of Belfast when suddenly he's surrounded by a group of Irishmen, probably drunk, when they ask him, they demand, Catholic or Protestant? Now, he has no idea what they are. So he takes the safe road. He says, atheist, actually. They are taken aback until one of them steps up and says, Catholic atheist or Protestant atheist? Now, you could easily substitute for Catholic and Protestant Sunni and Shiite. The United States was founded 240 years ago, exactly. On the 4th of July, it'll be 240 years. It's the creation of group genius, of Thomas Jefferson, of James Madison, James Monroe, George Gunston, many of them Virginians, the great General George Washington, the father of the country, Alexander Hamilton, and inspired by the philosophers, the English philosophers of John Locke, Hobbes, David Hobbes, and Adam Smith. And the French philosophers, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Diderot. After 200 years, it is still the most fundamentally sound nation, maybe fraying at the edges right now as we all feel some frustration with the politics going on. But it is the envy of the world, and it took 200 years to get to this point. It holds democracy, the secular state, separation of church and state, equality of genders as fundamental core principles. 100 years ago, Kemal Atatürk, after he proved himself invincible on the battlefield, took off his uniform and vowed never to put it on again. Then he established the modern Republic of Turkey with a wide range of reforms with secular democracy, separation of mosque and state, of gender equality at its core. He believed in governance by science and reason rather than by superstition and dogma. The greatest Turk of them all, Atatürk, compressed into 15 years what the United States and the rest of the West took 200 years to achieve. His defining credo, echoed in the logo of the Atatürk Society and at the statue on Sheridan Circle, reads, "Peace at home, peace in the world." I'd like to present Burak Şahin now, who will have the honors of introducing the distinguished board. Thank you, Board.
Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished guests and eminent panelists. Just as Professor Atalay mentioned, our discussion is on the role of secular governance in world peace and Ataturk's vision on the separation of religion and state. However, today we live in a world where scientists can build prosthetic limbs that can be controlled by thought. Physics has been pushing the boundaries of the standard model after the confirmation of the Higgs boson. And developments in AI or artificial intelligence have pushed things to such a level that the coupling of machine intelligence and basic human skill allow things that were unimaginable just a few years back. Yet, we've gathered here to revisit a phenomenon whose ancient roots lie in history as old as fear and discipline, but still wields considerable power. The separation of religion and state, laiklik as we call it in Turkish, from the French laïcité, is one of the fundamental tenets of the Kemalist revolution. And in fact, for many, it's the most important one amongst Atatürk's 6 principles. This is because secularism defines a clear delineation of affairs of the state and religious edict. It advocates a protection of beliefs and lack thereof from impositions of the government or the majority, and establishes the foundations of governance, education, and the laws, not on belief or dogma, but, again, just as Professor Atalay mentioned, on reason and science. It wasn't until the Turkish Republic that the world saw an explicitly secular government that was established by an Islamic society. And there have been attempts since at secular rule in Islamic societies with varying degrees of success. In the backdrop of secularist movements and efforts of reform, there has always existed a fundamentalist strain that gave rise to radical groups. Over the years, these groups have aligned themselves with different entities and powers, be they governing parties, be they opposition, or foreign interests. And these alliances have been the engine of instability that undermined the success of secular governments and regimes in Islamic societies in the past decades. When victory against communism was at stake, old story, Islamic fundamentalists of all shapes and forms were supported, funded and armed, overtly or covertly, secularism be damned. We all like to recall the Afghan Mujahideen, the Taliban, and think blowback, but organization of the 70s in Turkey, like the National Turkish Students Union, the MTTB, to those who will recall, the Organization to Combat Communism, KMD, Akgenç, or Warrior Youth, and the Eastern Warriors Front, all spawned from alliances of the same fundamentalist strain that fought against localized adversaries of the same era, different localized adversaries of the same era. And when fundamentalists proved too difficult to control, or their consequences of their actions too hard to bear, it was time to favor yet another group. This group also needed alliances, but nevertheless had no more use for secularism or reason than their less successfully advertised predecessors. The renewed brand was moderate Islam. To close this loop I've drawn, to come back to my main point, the extent to which Turkey has been able to adopt, apply, and protect secular governance has been one of the primary determinants of her standing and success in foreign policy, internal struggles, and geopolitical status. The last 10, 15, 20, even 30 years, in Turkey's legislative and governance history, there are lots of examples of the religious right directly or indirectly making, or the center-right or even the left, center-left, kowtowing to demands that erode Turkey's secular foundations. It's only in the last decade that the religious undertones have gone beyond an intrusion, invasion, or total takeover of the government and the public sphere. And now, things have morphed into such a cloud that affects Turkey's international politics just as directly, sowing seeds of sectarian strife to reap violence and death, and viewing foreign affairs from the same lens that is used to weigh domestic affairs. This lens is the lens of fundamentalism, whose sole focus is to survive and hold on to power at all costs. With fires and explosions shaking Turkey's cities in the east and west alike, borders all ablaze, and international prestige in shreds, we remember Atatürk's famed saying, "Peace at home, peace in the world," and see where we are. War at home, war along the borders. And therefore our question is this: what is the role of secular governance in world peace? Our first speaker is Michael Rubin. He's the author of Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. Mr. Rubin is a former Pentagon official whose major research areas are the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and diplomacy. He instructs senior military officers deploying to the Middle East and Afghanistan on regional politics, and he teaches classes regarding Iran, terrorism, and Arab politics on board deploying US aircraft carriers. He received his bachelor's in biology and PhD in history from Yale University. Mr. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, both pre- and post-war Iraq, and spent time with the Taliban prior to September 11. His presentation is titled, "Turkish Leadership on the Global Stage Isn't Sustainable Absent Atatürk's Vision." Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Rubin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I just have a few brief remarks on the subject. I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past, and admittedly, I usually only get that right about 50% of the time. But one of the drawbacks, at least according to my wife, of being a historian is sometimes in the evening when the kids are asleep, I'll curl up and look over old historical documents. And for something I was writing that should be out in the next couple days, I was looking at the diplomatic correspondence between the United States and Turkey in the weeks before Turkey joined NATO. And there was a fascinating document from January 1952, a conversation, it was an American document, top secret at the time, between the American ambassador and Foreign Minister Fuat Kaprulu, in which Fuat Kaprulu was talking about the importance of NATO, lamenting the fact that so many other countries in Europe wanted to receive the benefits of NATO without actually contributing materially in proportion to their capability, and also talking about the idea of NATO not simply being a defensive alliance, but rather being a community of democracies fighting against and standing up against autocracy. And of course, this is against the backdrop, even before Turkey joined NATO, of its participation in the Korean War, and of other elements taking leadership on the global stage, and it would soon also join with the short-lived Baghdad Pact and so forth. Now, if Turkey seeks a leadership role and decides that its priority, its goal is to raise a religious generation, as President Erdogan has said, then simply it's going to be one more religious state among many. Turkey may see themselves as the natural leader, but to base that leadership on being the inheritor, if you will, of the Ottoman Empire really doesn't work, simply because Turkey has a much fonder remembrance of its Ottoman heritage than many of the subject peoples do. Whether that's fair or unfair, we can put aside for another debate. But the point is, because of the rise of ethnic nationalism and so forth, many states have developed in the first decades and indeed the middle of the 20th century, really in a way in which they had an exclusive nationalism in which to be fully Syrian meant to be anti-Turk, to be fully Palestinian meant to be anti-Turk, and so forth. And we also see this in Turkish school books. And when you look at all the different peoples of the Middle East that at one point or another rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, they became the foundational national struggle in a narrative. Whether that narrative is fully accurate or not is besides the point, because perception means more than reality. However, what had always brought Turkey to the leadership role was this notion that it was a diverse society. It may not always have been a democracy, but it was always aspiring to be democratic. And in many ways, I mean, we can look at many other countries that weren't always democracies, but like Turkey did for a time triumphed. I'm thinking, for example, South Korea with Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee was no Democrat, but ultimately, after trials and tribulations, after a few coups to set South Korea back on the right track, South Korea has been thriving. So has Taiwan. And they have become economic leaders in their area. They have become models. Turkey, likewise, was a model. Now, one of Turkey's strengths, especially being in such a difficult neighborhood, isn't that it straddles Europe and Asia. Rather, it was such a diverse, tolerant society. So just think about the sectarian divisions which we heard about at the beginning between Sunnis and Shiites in the region. I mean, if you look at any history book or any sociological overview, they all say the Sunnis are 85 to 90% of the world's Muslim population. The Shiites are 10 to 15%, so what's the big deal? The big deal is between the Mediterranean, around the Gulf of Aden, all the way through the borders of Iran. You're at 50-50 parity, which is why there's a sense that absolutely everything is in play and that we're in a crisis mode for those that think in a strictly sectarian way. But Turkey was always a state where Sunni Muslims and Alevi Muslims and other variations, minority views and so forth, could live at peace, could interact with each other, study together, without the state pitting them against each other. Now, when we talk about raising a religious generation, of course, the first question is, well, what does religion mean? Who determines religion? You know that I work, my day job's at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-of-center think tank, and therefore I'm often interacting with many conservatives. And one of the fights I have with people who are very, very conservative is when they start raising Sharia conspiracies. When they start saying Sharia says this, Sharia says that, because my response to them is talking about Sharia, Islamic law, without actually talking about a specific strain of law or identifying what you mean is like talking about state law in the United States without ever identifying what state you're talking about, simply because there's no one single codified source of Islamic law. But to have to project an argument, as we hear increasingly, that there is one single interpretation which in itself is truth, is not only anti-religious, and is not only insulting to the diversity of Islam and Islamic practice in the debate which was always inherent in Islam, it also sets the stage for Turkey to set its population against each other, and we've seen this with regard to the Alevis in recent years. I mean, how many members of the AKP parliament are actually Alevi? How many back in 2002 were Alevi on the slate? If you say that you're working for representing the entire country, it's kind of disappointing that you can't find a single person to represent a community that might be 20% of the population. Now, what we really see in Turkey under Erdogan is not a model for leadership. There's one word for it. It's Pakistan. And when we look at the history of Pakistan, we can see where that necessarily leads. Now, Ataturk was wise in many other ways. First of all, let's clear up a common mistake in academia. Ataturk believed in, frankly, the separation of mosque and governance, but he wasn't anti-religious. And that itself is also a basis for the leadership of Ataturk's vision. You can respect religion. You can allow people to pray in whatever means they want. You're just not trying to hijack that religion as a cover for corruption or as a cover to avoid accountability and other aspects. But let's talk about gender for a second. And if we want to look at a more Islamist vision, we can look at a country like Saudi Arabia. Now, oftentimes, when we talk, for example, about Saudi women not being allowed to drive, in the American discourse, it's discussed solely as a feminist issue. It's not a feminist issue alone. It's also a middle-class issue. It's an economic issue, because those Saudis who are very wealthy are able to hire drivers for their wives or for their daughters. But for a middle-class family, where the woman wants to teach or wants to take a job or whatever, she can't teach or take a job if she doesn't have the money to hire a driver. And this becomes a catch-22. She can't hire a driver because she can't take a job because she doesn't have a job. She can't have a job because she doesn't have a driver. It was this sort of frustrating sociological and economic catch-22 that Ataturk's vision helped Turkey escape from, or I should actually say, ensure that Turkey wouldn't fall into the trap of. But now when the goal is to have to have 3 children. When we look at the statistics of at every level of the Turkish bureaucracy, how women are slowly being put out to pasture, if it were, then we see not a vision for leadership, we see a vision for poverty. Now, Recep Tayyip Erdogan deserves some credit for the economic boon that Turkey experienced, but not all of the credit which he often seeks. I mean, after all, we often don't talk about the demographic dividend which Turkey benefited from, the wave which he rode, and the wave which is coming to an end. So it's essential that Turkey maximize all of its human capital rather than antagonize all of its human capital. Now, Erdogan's approach also will not bring peace. And of course, we talk about no problems with the neighbors. And when I was last in Turkey, a prominent Turkish politician from Ataturk's party just ran down the list of all the countries which Recep Tayyip Erdogan isn't allowed to step foot in right now, or capitals he can't visit. He can't go to Jerusalem. One might say he's pro-Palestinian, but he's not really welcome in Ramallah either, simply because he's so pro-Hamas. Well, he's not, even if the Saudi king will come and visit, Erdogan himself isn't very welcome in Riyadh. If he did come, he'd be treated worse than Barack Obama was by the Saudis. He's not particularly all that welcome in Abu Dhabi. He's not welcome in Armenia. He's not welcome in Moscow. He's not welcome in Egypt. And this isn't the sign of a man who has really cemented Turkish leadership in the way that Ataturk did. And all you have to do is look around the world at all the different postage stamps, for example, outside of Turkey, who honored Ataturk. The very fact that decades after Ataturk's death, people still talk about, even if sometimes debating, the notion of him as a leader. That's not something you hear with many other world leaders from the time about his model. When it comes to other issues, Erdogan's not going to bring peace internally in Turkey. I mean, let's be realistic. Turkey has long had a dispute with Kurds. And this is a dispute which successive Turkish governments have tried to address. What Recep Tayyip Erdogan's view is to try to force people to subordinate their identities, both Turkish, culturally Kurdish, and others, and prioritize religion. And that's something which simply isn't acceptable to so many people, regardless of what their ethnic identity or home language is. And so in a way, when people accuse Ataturk, for example, of discriminating against this minority or that minority, well, it's kind of hypocritical when the current Turkish government talks about this, because what they are arguing is that no one should have an identity aside from their religious identity. Likewise, and I'll conclude here because I'm trying to be a little bit provocative, but I want to turn the floor over for my colleagues on the panel and then focus most of our time on questions and answers. I just want to point out that when you are standing alone, sometimes that means being a leader. But when you're standing alone with Hamas, and when you're standing alone with Daesh, and ultimately that means you're not a leader. It means you're a pariah. And that would be a full tragedy for Turkey. Unfortunately, sometimes you only realize what you have lost, or what you once had, I should say, when you have lost it. Let's hope that that loss isn't permanent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin, for that beautiful and also indeed provocative speech. Our second speaker is Sean Faircloth, the mayor of Bangor, Maine, and the author of Attack of the Theocrats: How the Religious Right Harms Us All and What We Can Do About It. Mr. Faircloth's famed 2014 speech, titled "Can Secular Government Survive in a Muslim Nation?" was delivered in Istanbul and got 200,000 views on YouTube and Dailymotion. This is quite remarkable, especially considering the total YouTube ban that was in effect in Turkey at the time. And this is only one of the many speeches that he delivered, which drew thousands of viewers to YouTube. Mayor Faircloth, how is it now? Okay. Mayor Faircloth served 10 years in the Maine legislature, including a term as majority whip, and successfully spearheaded over 30 laws, many promoting science and the scientific viewpoint. He also led the multi-million-dollar Maine Discovery Museum project, credited with restoring the heart to downtown Bangor, from conception to completion of operation. The mayor is a cum laude graduate of the University of Notre Dame and the University of California, Hastings College of Law. His presentation is titled, "Why the World Should Follow Ataturk Rather Than See Turkey Abandon Him." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the mayor of Bangor, Maine, Mr. Faircloth.
Thank you. I just wanted to appreciate Bülent Atalay's comment about the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland. My family's from Ireland. The O'Flanagans are from Northern Ireland, which is my grandmother's family. And my father, sometimes he'd be asked, well, are you religious? And he'd say, no, I'm agnostic. I'm an Irish Catholic agnostic. And so that struck home with me. So I'm here today to talk about the heritage of Ataturk, and particularly what I think is relevant about it to America and to the world. When Paris was attacked, Je suis Charlie exploded all over Facebook in America, expressing solidarity with the people of France. That's very commendable. We saw the same for Belgium when 35 were killed there recently. But just days before the bombings in Belgium, 41 were killed in bombings in Turkey. So did we see Je suis Turkey? It wasn't happening. January 15th, 30 were killed in Burkina Faso by al-Qaeda. Coverage in American media was minimal, shall we say. 18 killed by al-Qaeda in the Ivory Coast just before the Belgian attacks. Attacks in Mali, Tunisia, Indonesia, Somalia. Little American attention. Now, I admire President Obama. I did the hometown welcome in Bangor, Maine for candidate Obama back in 2008, but I do have to ask a question, why? Did President Obama lower the flag for France? Oui. For Belgium? Oui. But for Turkey? No. Now, is it because Belgium and France are more populated nations? Well, as people here would know, even when you combine the population of Belgium and France, they don't quite match up to the population of Turkey. So America's Eurocentric view makes America the poor. Now, I understand that part of Turkey is in Europe, but most Americans don't know that. And I think that the Eurocentric view is one that is problematic, and problematic for Americans and for our own self-interest. You know, I have 3 sons, and I think I can vouch that American children love stories, and they love stories about time travel. And therefore, I think American children should know about a leader who is almost unique in the history of the world, a leader who engaged in time travel as much and as far as it is humanly possible to do so. And many Americans do not know that, according to many Turks themselves, that Turkey, or then the dying Ottoman Empire, was a medieval country in the early 20th century. Today, we often speak about dread of something like a caliphate, an Islamic dictatorship running various territories throughout the world. Well, at that time, in the general population in what is now Turkey, they were not necessarily among the populace resisting the caliphate. Turkey was and is an overwhelmingly Muslim nation. The conservative Islamic restrictions on freedom were mandated from above. And then there emerges this time traveler, A military leader, yes, of nearly unprecedented skill, who industrialized an almost entirely non-industrial nation, thus using that industrial might to transform it into military power and able to push back Western powers to gain independence for this country. Then this almost unique person in human history, this unique event occurred where this strong military leader, this powerful military leader, chose what? Did he choose to crush his citizenry for more power for himself? He actually thought of something entirely different. This military leader chose, I think, a form of time travel where he moved through the centuries with his people. Think of what happened to this medieval nation in a few short years. Ataturk instituted the popular vote to a medieval Islamic state. Ataturk abolished religious courts, established the right to vote, including for women, higher education for women, welcomed women into training for careers, women permitted to dress without Muslim control of their clothes, sexist polygamy abolished, equal rights for women in courts. Ataturk revered the arts. And he reversed the Muslim law, thus allowing depictions of the human body in art. You saw a dramatic increase in literacy with a dramatic reform of language that facilitated that literacy. Ataturk, the time traveler, created secular courts to help settle disputes in society. In this medieval state, Ataturk modernized industry, agriculture, railways, banking to the economic benefit of the people. With open arms, Ataturk invited Jewish scientists to an overwhelmingly Muslim nation in defiance of Hitler. This military man sought peace, refusing to seek control of other previously Ottoman territories, and remained peacefully within the Turkish homeland. Talk about time travel. Who else saw so far into the future and brought a nation with him to that future? Even Franklin Roosevelt, who can claim great credit for the transformation of a nation, cannot claim to have started with anything close to a medieval state. There are few, if any, other times in history in which the modern vision, the futuristic vision of one human being, brought a nation so far forward so quickly. As I document in my book, people like Ted Cruz want to impose some religious laws on America in the 21st century. Thus, Ataturk is in many ways much more of a civil libertarian than many candidates in 2016. Ataturk, the time traveler, Ataturk, the man born in 1881, could debate Ted Cruz and take a more modern position on the issues. Ataturk offered tax reform that benefited low-income people. Bernie Sanders, take note. Offering free compulsory education. Again, Bernie Sanders, take note. Now, hardcore Islamists disliked Ataturk at that time in the 1920s for abolishing the caliphate and for expunging and forced religion from the public space. They called Ataturk a womanizer and a drunk and a crypto Jew, whatever that means. Sadly, though, these elements still exist in Turkey today, and more sadly have grown stronger, embodied by the current near dictatorship in Turkey of Mr. Erdogan, who uses a religious veneer to cover a myriad of financial sins and financial improprieties. Turkey now, we see, is a place where journalists are widely censored, newspapers are taken over, social media is often shut down. At last count, 1,845 people have been prosecuted for insulting Erdogan just in the last couple of years. Sadly, Obama has been largely silent about Erdogan's oppressive regime. And I'm sure glad there is no law in the United States like the one they have in Germany that Chancellor Merkel is obeying that allows for prosecution of German citizens for satirizing Erdogan. I'm glad that's not a law here, because if anybody's seen my speech that went viral on YouTube, I could be prosecuted here for a lot of things I say in that speech. Now, Erdogan seeks he seeks to intertwine government and Islam, often for financial gain for himself and for his allies. And Erdogan said, and I'm quoting him, "You can't bring women and men into equal position. That is against nature," close quote. Now, Erdogan was born in 1954, but time traveler Ataturk, born in 1881, said, and I quote, "If henceforward women do not share in the social life of our nation, we shall never attain our full development. We shall remain irredeemably backward." He also said, and I quote, "Humankind is made up of two sexes, women and men. It is possible for humankind to grow by the improvement. Is it possible for them to grow by the improvement of only one part, while the other part is ignored? Is it possible that half of a mass is tied to earth with chains, and that the other can soar to the skies?" Think of a futuristic vision of the world. Obviously, Ataturk had for his time a fantastically futuristic vision of women's rights, but his futuristic vision goes even beyond that. He said, I quote, "My people are going to learn the principles of democracy, the dictates of truth, and the teachings of science. Superstition must go. Let them worship as they will. Every man can follow his own conscience, provided it does not interfere with the sane reason or bid him against the liberty of his fellow men." Ataturk seems even more modern than some of our most modern leaders today. He said, and I quote, "We do not consider our principles as dogmas that are said to come from heaven. We derive our inspiration not from heaven or from an unseen world, but directly from life." Close quote. Many Americans, sadly, do not appreciate or take into account or are even aware of Ataturk. But one American who did take note of Ataturk was President Kennedy, who said, "The name of Ataturk brings to mind the historic accomplishments of one of the great men of this century, his inspired leadership of the Turkish people, his perceptive understanding of the modern world." I want to thank Bülent Atalay for bringing to my attention the book he referenced, The King of the Mountain, which analyzed leadership in the 20th century. The author seeks to use objective criteria to measure leadership, and while Franklin Roosevelt stands near the pinnacle, it rates Ataturk the highest of all leaders of the 20th century. One can debate who is best and who is strongest, but there can be no doubt that if the test is time travel, if the test is a leader seeing the furthest and bringing others along, Ataturk is surely near the top. As I said, the lack of knowledge of Ataturk is America's loss. This loss, I think, can be attributed to at least two factors. First is the Eurocentrism of America that diminishes our educational system and limits the scope of what Americans learn, and thus limits our knowledge, our context, and our perspective. Second is the rejection of the, and I think the two doctrinaire rejection of the so-called great man theory of history. Today, it is often accepted that change only bubbles up from the people, that politicians merely react. I suggest that view is too limited. In the first half of the 20th century, the great man theory was too dominant and didn't sufficiently take into account the leadership offered by the common people. But conversely, I suggest it is dangerous to reject that leaders do indeed matter. They do indeed sometimes take action that involves more than mere reaction. Erdogan is, sadly, in my view, probably the most powerful leader Turkey has had since Ataturk. And the decisions he makes do indeed matter. They matter for America, and they matter for the world. I think ominously, but they do matter. Conversely, a leader like Ataturk stands as a shining example that once in a rare while, there is a leader of time-traveling vision and skill who can move people to a vastly greater justice and progress and compassion than people had heretofore experienced when that person has their hand on the tiller of power. Should American school children know about Charles de Gaulle? Of course they should. But even more so, American children who even now grow up in the most powerful nation on earth need to know, are benefited to know of the life of Ataturk. That it is his example. Certainly, yes, it's an example for Turkish people, but his is an example for citizens of the world. And that Turkey, if it is not such a faraway place to American school children, that if we learn from the experience, and if we learn from the dangers of attacks on freedom by people like Erdogan, then perhaps when these children grow up, they are more ready to act for justice, and more ready to act for the highest ideals, not only of this nation, but the highest ideals of the human race, which are so greatly embodied by Ataturk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Faircloth. That too was incredibly beautiful. Our third and final speaker is Mr. Metin Chamil. Mr. Chamil writes on political and social matters concerning Turkey and the international community. He is a former president of the Ataturk Society of America and a trustee of the Global Foundation. I hope I'm not going to butcher the name of his hometown. Mr. Chamil is a graduate of Ankara University Law School. He started his career in the Turkish diplomatic service, subsequently serving as Director of Foreign Relations and Secretary of the Turkish Atomic Energy Commission. Thereafter, he served as legal officer in the International Atomic Energy Agency and retired as Special Assistant to the Director General. In retirement, Mr. Chamil has served as a legal counsel to several international organizations in the nuclear field. His presentation is titled, Reason, a Prerequisite for Lasting Peace. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Chamil. Forth and back.
Very good, thank you. Thank you, Burak Bey, for this introduction. And to be the speaker after such wonderful speeches that we have heard, I will try my best. A discussion about the role of secular governance on world peace necessarily leads to the proposition that meddling of religion in state affairs is, at the least, one of the sources of conflicts. This theory cannot be denied in light of the history of innumerable civil unrest and wars waged in the name of religion. However, the same history shows us that even secular states made wars, and many times over, of course. The conclusion, therefore, the first conclusion would be that secularism didn't succeed to take religion out of governance. Is there a means to cleanse governance from religion? This is what I will try to explore. The term secularism is used generally to represent the principle of separation of church and state. Secularism is no doubt, as you know, the child of 16th and 17th centuries Enlightenment, but the church put up a fierce fight to deny people's sovereignty and to retain its power for another 300 years. This tug-of-war gradually, of course, ended in a tie called secularism. It is sort of a balance or a separate but equal dualism. It is, in fact, a compromise in the absence of victory by either side. A couple of weeks ago, I heard yet another description of secularism from a French professor, and it's a beauty, that it is a relation between religion and politics, unquote. Secularism has two shortcomings, in my opinion. First, secularism is the child of half-pregnancy. Because secularism, well, half-pregnancy, we usually use it to express the impossible. But, well, religions that made the Immaculate Conception possible, I guess the half-pregnancy was not a big deal. So secularism is, as practice, it is being half pregnant because it does take the state out of religion, but it does not take religion out of state. Oh, not yet. Oh, did it move? Sorry. In our US example, the wording of the last provision of the Constitution, which led to the adoption of the first provision of the Bill of Rights, as you know, set the scene for this malpractice here in the United States. As examples of the meddling of religion in political decision-making in the US, we all need to recall only a few examples. I will mention one maybe that you all are already well aware. George Bush II said at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in 2005, I quote, "I welcome faith to help solve the nation's deepest problems," unquote. No wonder then, when asked whether he consulted George Bush the first before going to Iraq War, his answer was that he consulted his higher father. And in the same year, in an address to Palestinian leaders of all the people, these too many buttons, too sensitive around here. And of all the people to Palestinian leaders, he said, I quote, "I am driven with a mission from God," unquote. And Jimmy Carter stated in his book, Our Endangered Values, I quote, "Religious beliefs have been inextricably entwined with the political principles I have adopted," unquote. Similar examples can be found for many presidents and in our daily political life, or sadly, even in Supreme Court decisions. Chief Justice Rehnquist, in a minority opinion, referred to the separation of church and state as, I quote, "a metaphor which has proven useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned," unquote. If governance is so tainted with religion, where politicians struggle for power, religion becomes the power. Yet we still try to spread secularism worldwide, along with freedom and democracy. I would rather say that secular governance is not true separation of church and state. Hence, no separation, no peace. The other problem with secularism is that it is the product only of the Christian culture. Its reference point was the biblical concept, as you know, of separating Caesar and God. Accordingly, while still clinging on to the spiritual power, man's rights and freedom were also given recognition, and consequently, it was agreed that man could govern their worldly affairs. Okay. This worldview, however, is absent, in particular in the Muslim world. There was no such reference point as Caesar and God at the inception of Islam. There is only God, and the guardian of his message is this state. God's power cannot be shared or relinquished in Islam. While there is no organization in Islam, every real Muslim is a soldier, a defender, and of course a loose cannon for Islam. This is what makes peace difficult to reach in today's world. You'll have to go to war, whether or not you are secular, if you are attacked. I conclude from this that secularism, not being universal, it does not promise peace. The immediate remedy found for the shortcomings of secularism was a stricter separation of church and state. Although the separation concept was put on paper with the American Bill of Rights and the French Constitution of 1795, the French clergy continued to influence the conservative representatives of the parliament. This interference made it necessary to introduce a stricter separation. The concept of laicism, therefore, was born in 1905 in France. And remarkably, it was first, the term laicism was first used in the education system of France. Since now I mentioned laicism, let me show you one of these buttons. No. There. It's not full. No. That's not.
You can just move this one.
It has to come together. No. No. There is only one.
If you keep pressing this, it's going to go forward. This is the end of the presentation. I don't have any other.
Mm-hmm. No. Well, the illustration is not there. It is only half of it. All right, let us have the, okay, let's show that one. This is this is the illustration that I've been using in similar lectures for embedding in the memory of my audience the difference, the stark difference between secularism and laicism. For some reason, I think I have the flash drive with me. Maybe in advance it was sent, but only half of it shows. This is the laicism. On the same screen, there is S representing secularism and L represent laicism. And I represent the separation of church and state in secularism on top of S, right? And therefore, in that case, separation of church and state is closer to heaven, and it is a balance, as I said, on a slippery slope, whereas laicism is well-grounded, and the separation is achieved by a strong wall. Well, it may not be as strong as Trump's wall that he is thinking of building in the South, but at any rate, it is a wall. Now, the laik concept, in my own words, is human beings, being social animals, they get organized. They are the ones who found the state, not God. Therefore, the state may only be laik, in my opinion. Of course, we have to put laicism to the same test of whether it helps peace as we do secularism. I will take the best known and maybe the only example of the relation between laik policies and peaceful international relations. The policies of Thomas Jefferson and Ataturk. I need not quote here documents like Jefferson letters with John Adams and others, and Ataturk speeches, which you all are very familiar with. I will refer to only some of their deeds to demonstrate my point. Of course, Jefferson preceded the emergence of laicism by about 100 years, but I believe he was the precursor of laicism because his famous and striking description of the separation concept as a wall. During his presidency, he didn't go to war. He refused, despite all domestic and foreign pressures, to go against France during Napoleonic Wars, or against Britain, which engaged in a trade war with the US. He achieved the largest territorial expansion in the US history, peacefully, through the famous Louisiana Purchase. Then he opened the possibility of marching further to the west by launching the Lewis and Clark expedition instead of a military expedition. Atatürk didn't go to war either during his presidency. He reversed, through skillful diplomacy, the Lausanne Treaty provisions that limited Turkey's sovereignty over the Istanbul waterways. He achieved the accession of Hatay province to Turkey through diplomacy. During the interwar period, he formed regional alliances which included countries that fought against Turkey during World War I, and even those that invaded it after the war, in both of which he actively served as victorious commander. Although 100 years and thousands of miles apart, one common point between these two men was that they were both believers in reason. Thus, they both approached international affairs peacefully. Now, from this, we can conclude that their examples of laic governance may promise us peace. However, although these two examples suggest that there may be a correlation between laic leadership and peace, their peaceful policies didn't last long either after their demise. Soon after the term of office of Jefferson expired, the US went to war with Britain. Atatürk's laicism fell victim to the vagaries of democracy. Separation principle being intimately tied to democracy, uneducated masses delivered totalitarianism in Turkey. It is not only Tayyip who is the dictator and who introduced the totalitarianism in Turkey. The Turkish people brought them over there in a golden plate. The current Islamist dictator of Turkey dragged a good part of the international community into the neighboring Syrian quagmire. The quagmire that was the extension of the one created in Iraq by the American leader who took his advice from his higher father. Medieval, barbaric, savage actions ongoing in the Middle East in the name of religion are enough proof that secularism or even laicism in governance is not enough for achieving global peace. My conclusion is laicity of governance alone does not ensure sustainability of peace. Jefferson and Atatürk examples show that peace achieved by laic governance is fragile if citizens, or at least a good majority of them, do not subscribe to laicism. The two leaders mentioned foreshadowed even a solution for this. The only war Jefferson declared during his presidency was against tyranny over the mind of man. You will recall that he's the founder of University of Virginia. He is the one who restocked the Library of Congress when it was rebuilt after the Brits burnt it down. Well, many other examples that you may recall yourselves. Atatürk's only war in peacetime was also for education, science, and especially, particularly, progress. And in this case, you will recall, for example, the changing of the alphabet from the Arabic to Latin in order to enable the population to have access to the scientific and technological resources of the West. And he's the one who founded the network of the so-called people's houses, where the modern education, a modern way of life was brought to the villagers. and many other examples again that you may recall. Atatürk's laicism, having included laic education, was the perfect prescription, especially for the Muslim world. Global peace will remain a distant ideal, in my opinion, without a true separation of church and state generally accepted through education of masses for reasoning instead of for believing. Before I conclude, let me share with you an experience of the Atatürk Society's first president, Orhan Tarhan, because I find it demonstrates so well the argument for laic education. He once asked a French Franciscan priest how he reconciles his priesthood with the laic politics of his country. His answer was simple but striking: I am a French citizen. The priest's answer shows us that in a truly laic system, even a cleric can be laic as he must be when it concerns politics. I conclude, therefore, that laic education of people, as much as laic governance, is the prerequisite of sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chamil. Now, do we have any questions for our panelists?
Thank you very much for a very edifying number of presentations. I have a brief comment on the religious background, and then I have a question. My comment on the religious background is that the West should remember that the future of Christianity began with the victory of Constantine and making Christianity, in effect, a state religion. And it evolved into the Holy Roman Empire with a series of alliances between kings and popes that lasted 800 years. So I think that background in the West should be kept in mind with this paranoia about caliphates. The other comment is that the phrase wall of separation does not appear in the First Amendment to the Constitution. However, the origin of that phrase was a letter by Thomas Jefferson to a town council in Danbury, Connecticut. And if you look that up, Jefferson's letter to Danbury, Connecticut, is where Mr. Jefferson used that phrase, wall of separation. That's where it originated. My question is, Ataturk was facing a relatively clean slate. There wasn't much else to turn to at that time, and it was wide open for the work of a determined individual with a vision. However, the situation today, unfortunately, there is a widespread of authoritarian populism. We see that with Mr. Erdogan, we see that in Russia's Putin, we see that to some degree with Mr. Trump today. We see that in the rise of right-wing parties in Europe, for example, in Hungary. So the challenge is very different today. And there are good leaders, there are also bad leaders. So I think part of the problem today is how to face what I would call the problem of historical forces.
Thank you.
If I may say a few words in response, I'm just going to respond to one aspect of your question, in which you were talking about Ataturk had a relatively blank slate, as opposed to today, where there's certainly, and I agree with you, the rise of authoritarians, and you named a whole host. But when we look back to Ataturk's life and to his rise, it was anything but certain. I mean, we see the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. If we look at any of the new states that were established in the wake of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, of which the 100th anniversary will be in just a couple weeks on May 16th, we see that many of those states, rather than embracing the vision of Ataturk, decided to embrace a vision which was regressive in many ways, and we see the result of that. And so, while I agree with much of what you said, the idea that somehow Ataturk had an easy time simply because there wasn't the competition of ideas, I would simply oppose, because it seems that at the time, Ataturk very much was a minority. There were a whole host of forces, military and ideological, arrayed against him. And it's simply because he not only stuck to his military guns, quite literally, but also to his ideological principles, that Turkey was able to emerge as something far different, and in many ways far more miraculous than many of the states around it.
Well, I think you captured most of what I agree with. To me, it is a remarkable situation. When I look to my own 1/100th% of trying to get policy through, I stand in awe of what this guy accomplished, because, you know, I think it was mentioned in my introduction, in my little legislature, we tried to get 30 laws through. Well, I tried 100, you know what I mean? It's really tough to try to get a policy from an idea to some governor signing it, for example. And to me, I guess one big advantage I do think Ataturk had, and the world is lucky that he didn't choose a different path, is that because he was so successful militarily, such a strong military leader, that I think there was an appeal that a lot of military leaders have. I mean, when Napoleon first, he comes to mind for me. Napoleon was a strong military leader and perceived as such at first, and he shifted in a direction of self-aggrandizement. And I really feel it's amazing and commendable that Ataturk had this kind of vision of himself where he rejected that in almost a Washingtonian way. Obviously, he absorbed a huge amount of power that he used, but it seemed like he directed so much of it in enlightened ways that it's truly skilled, remarkable, and amazing that he was successful in doing so. Just the mechanics of the kind of changes that you'd have to administer. I'm not an expert, like I think probably many other people in this room are, but just the logistics of trying to modernize a society in that amount of time strikes me as a tremendous administrative challenge, just that, in addition to the ideological leadership that you'd have to offer to get there. I did want to add, when you talk about the letter to Jefferson, because that does go back to my book, and just to underscore my view of it, I don't care what anybody's religious view of things is, but I am inspired and pleased. You're right, it is in a letter, it's not in the Constitution, about the wall of separation of church and state, but that adamance is throughout Jefferson's life. I mean, if you think about Jefferson compared to a lot of politicians today, Jefferson took a knife to the Bible, literally, and cut out all the supernatural parts and said, we'll just take these parts where Jesus says be nice, essentially. And removed, literally excised, the things that had to do with miracles. And so this is the Jeffersonian Bible. And I think, you know, what if Barack Obama had thrown that idea out? I'm going to take a knife to the Bible. What do you guys think? I think that the reaction might have been different. And so there was a unique time in American history as well where you had people like Jefferson, and then also who I think gets less light shined on him than maybe he should, is Madison, who was really his partner all the way through on these things, particularly constitutionally. And his phrase was literally, quote, I believe in the total, that was Madison's word, I believe in the total separation of church and state. So America was also remarkably founded by remarkable people.
Well, Sean answered to the question of Jefferson's statement. And you mentioned that the Constitution doesn't mention it. I gave the example there to show that the last provision of the Constitution, which in fact wasn't found by the states when it came to adopt it, which then led to the Bill of Rights. Okay, so in the first provision of the Bill of Rights, again, it was a half provision, because, as I said, it prohibits the state to interfere with religion, but it does not provide for religion not to interfere with state. So this is the point I wanted to make, and that is why I find secularism, as it is practiced, in fact, as I said, all along, not only here in the States, in fact, in Turkey, Tayyip interpreted secularism his own way. Sarkozy himself, when he was president, he said voting is only at the time of election, or something like that. Democracy is at the time of election. So it's like that secularism, they, like democracy, they interpret it their own ways. That is the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll go with one. So, Mayor Faircloth, what you mentioned about education, that is a point that I actually did a little bit of research and rehashing about in recent times. And when I look at the past 10 or more than 10 years, starting from, say, 2002 all the way up to now, I see, and most of you are witness to, a lot of efforts to change the Turkish education system at all conceivable levels, from grade school all the way up to secondary and tertiary education even. And this had its main pillars, and those pillars were all targeted. Imam Hatip schools, or the clergy schools, you all are familiar, and what was at first happening with them was a lot of them were being opened up one after another, and with the 4+4+4, it came to such a stage that some people whose districts were zoned in certain ways had then no option to send their children to any other school but clergy schools. For higher education, the Council of Higher Education, they were gunning for it from the beginning. And even though the law surrounding it was already not very democratic in the first place, because it was very much a child of the 1980 junta, after Professor Kemal Gürüz's term ended, and he was, by the way, one of the people who were charged in the sham Ergenekon case, they tried to and managed to alter the law with that too, so that they could have greater control of the educational higher education. And finally with TÜBİTAK, the Turkish Scientific and Research Council, their control over that was also very much something that they wanted, and after 2005 onward, I think, they also tried to change that. So what I'm wondering is, if such a systematic way of changing education or shaping young minds takes effect, and untampered with, keeps going, say you lose a generation, and suppose, not by time travel, but say, let's say, a leap of dimension, we have a completely different science and reason-based government in Turkey that came into power, had all the ability to change their bureaucrats or change the foundation of the system and try to change the education system. How long do you think that would take to bring the country's mindset back to science and reason again? I know it's a mouthful, but up to discussion, please.
It sounds like you're eager to jump in if you want. That's a big question, how are you going to make that change? Obviously, Ataturk made changes in a rapid time frame, but he's unusual. I don't know if you want to. I have a couple thoughts. Well, I mean, you raise a valid point. I always think, I went to Notre Dame, and the old saying where the Jesuit says, give me the child till he's 6 and I give you the man. And so what you say is valid and a valid concern. That is to say, if this infiltration of religion into education, and lack of secularism in education is a generational problem. And you're right. I don't know that there's a way to snap your fingers and say there is a solution. In fact, my only hope from this end, not being, a Turkish citizen or someone who would claim to have true influence there, is that I wish that the United States government would be willing to make more of an effort. And I liked what President Carter did back in the 1970s, where he talked about human rights as being an important criteria of foreign policy. But to say, part of that is free, compulsory, secular education is a human right that we'd want to see established throughout the world. And if you're shifting away from that, I would like to see the American government say more and express more about that concern.
Yes, I wanted to two comments. One is that about the education here in the United States, at least, I would recommend how it has changed. I would recommend all of you to read Education's End by Kronman, a Harvard University professor, and you will see what we are talking about, what kind of education it should be, and what has disappeared along the years from the education system. So that's one comment I want to make. The other one is that the education is so important. As you gave a short overview of the situation in Turkey, for example, the Islamists in Turkey, this AKP party and the Tayyip's clan, let us not forget that the country didn't become like this overnight. And because even today, still they are, today's polls in fact show that about 50%, it ranges from 45, 50, 51, and so it goes around that they support the government's and especially president's policies. And when you ask Turks, there was, I think it was a Pew poll or Gallup poll a couple of years ago. They say, when they are asked whether you're a Muslim or you're a Turk, they say, I'm a Muslim. So it didn't become like this overnight. The Islamists know very well that education is the basis of all of this. As you said, it takes time. Yes. My experience is that it takes 2 generations to change the whole mind of the masses altogether. And in fact, now today's situation in Turkey started in the 1960s because Islamists, every time they would come to the coalition government, the very first ministry that they want to take is education. So bit by bit, with salami tactique, they have introduced religion into the system, into education system, and today it has taken all over. And that's why, as Michael referred to, a pious generation they want to raise. They already have, but for the future, they want to secure it.
If I could just add 2 points. I largely agree, but unfortunately, when it comes to 2 generations, Turkey's not a controlled environment, nor are any other countries. And I'm talking about this in terms of a science analogy where you can control all the variables. I come to Turkey relatively late in my life. I've made a career out of studying Iran, and of course, one of the foundational notions, aspects of the Islamic Republic was the tremendous flight of Iranians away from Ayatollah Khomeini's vision. Now, the United States, admittedly, has been a great beneficiary of the Iranian diaspora. But when we look at the problem of brain drain, This is what I worry about as hampering any future recovery in Turkey. When we look at societies which have changed radically, Lebanon's greatest export has always been its people. The same thing is true with Palestine, West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so what once was a very cosmopolitan, mercantile generation has now left. And what we see in society in Lebanon, outside certain neighborhoods of Beirut, of course, I'm not talking about Hamra, I'm talking about Lebanon more broadly, or what we see in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank is very different than just a couple generations ago. The same thing is true in Iran, and frankly, the same thing is true with Israel, where many much more secular Israelis have left the country, and therefore, also because of the discrepancy in birth rates, you have a much greater religious character in Israel outside of Tel Aviv, for example, the Tel Aviv enclave, we could say. Now, what I worry about in Turkey is just informally knowing so many Turks who no longer feel safe in Ankara. Perhaps their names have been floated in various newspapers, Yeni Shafak or Saba or whatever. So they take the, they recognize that it's time to leave. They no longer feel safe in Istanbul, but maybe they go back for several months a year to Bodrum. Well, Bodrum isn't going to be an enclave, a safe enclave forever. And it's not just a passive manifestation. When I look at, for example, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and I spend a lot of my time in Iraq still. And whenever I'm in Iraq, I hear all the conspiracy theories about how the United States is behind the Islamic State. And what I always point out I was doing this in the shrine of Imam Hussein just a couple months ago when I was having a dialogue there, was before the United States started flying its fighter jets over Syria in 2014. President Obama announced that change of tactic in September 10th, 2014. The only country flying its aircraft in Syrian airspace was the Syrian governments. They not once bombed the Islamic State capital of Raqqa. They wanted that binary for their own cynical reasons. But what they were using their Air Force for was to drop barrel bombs on the civilian population. That was for the express purpose of creating the refugee flow to change demography. What some in Turkey, what we see with some of the, clearly fraudulent court cases and the crackdown, and at one point, 1 out of every 5 or 6 flag officers have been arrested, was a deliberate attempt to change the demography of Turkey so that never again could there be a rebound once Recep Tayyip Erdogan was out of the picture. Recep Tayyip Erdogan knows that with the exception of the Republican People's Party, whenever you've had a charismatic leader who has had majority control, be it with Adnan Menderes, or be it with Togut and the Democrat Party, or Togut Özal with the Motherland Party, that party has not survived the death of the leader. And we see with the AKP how faction-ridden it is. What Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants to, that doesn't mean I agree with any of the factions, but there are distinct factions. What Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants to do is change the demography by driving out those who would be the engines of the rebound. Now, one final point, and this may be a little bit controversial in the American context, but perhaps not as much in the Turkish context. One of the greatest societal, one of the phenomena in Turkey, which hasn't been undone, is the notion of conscription. Now, when we look at the Turkish military today, with fraudulent charges which derailed the normal promotion process, Erdogan has been able to handpick many of the senior generals and other flag officers. And when we figure that with the AKP coming to power in 2002, everyone at the rank of major or below was really raised in the Erdogan generation. That leaves the colonels and the brigadier generals. Now, the point of this is, if there is a new leadership, it will take at least 14 years to rinse out of the military the notion to return to the principles of Ataturk. The question is, it's quite a challenge, and I'm not sure also, and I'm talking across all bureaucracies now, whether I see the planning which could be necessary in order to have a serious discussion once Erdogan is defeated in an election or leaves power, passes away, what have you, a real discussion not only about how we're going to hold power, how we're going to achieve power, but how we're going to try to undo some of the damage. And part of the problem, if I may, and now I'll be especially provocative, has to do with some of the political party laws inside Turkey, where each of the political parties runs as, I'll be blunt, as its own dictatorship internally. And this oftentimes removes the accountability from uncharismatic leaders who haven't been able to achieve their vision and perhaps whose presence is preventing the beginning of this rebound at an earlier point in time. Thank you.
Gee, I just can't figure out which leaders you're talking about. Any other? Okay.
Well, my name is Hidayat Avalar. I'm the chairman of the Atatürk Society of America. 20 years ago, we had a first panel discussion was the rise of fundamentalism in Turkey. Now, what you see today in Turkey is almost worse than the Iran, almost. What do you think about the between relation with the Fethullah Gülen, who lives in Pennsylvania, with the relation with the Al-Tayyib bin Arab relation? Al-Tayyib bin Arab, what I call the Erdogan, Arab, son of the Arab. So what do you think about those?
Are you asking me?
Right here. I missed that.
He said Al-Tayyib bin Arab.
Okay, sorry. Let me put it this way. I'll answer this as a series of questions, because I don't think there's certainty as to the answers. Different movements evolve, and certainly the Gulenist movement has a past, including with regard to some of the evidence that was supplied to support the fraudulent Ergenekon trial and so forth, which is shameful. However, they've seen that a monster whom they helped to create has turned against them. It's not simply a dispute as to the finances of a network of schools. So one question out there is, to what extent has the Hizmet learned the lessons of their mistakes, learned from their mistakes? And I actually believe, perhaps more than some others, that they truly do understand where they went wrong and wish to make amends for that. The second question out there, which certainly no one talks about in a meeting with supporters of Fethullah Gülen generally, is, of course, Fethullah Gülen is unwell in terms of his health. And one of the issues we don't talk about is what is going to happen to that movement after he passes away. I mean, can we look at it as a shadow political party where once the charismatic leader is removed from the stage, the movement more or less disappears? Or does it have a staying power? I mean, it certainly has become an economic engine not only in Turkey, but throughout Africa and elsewhere with many of its schools. But it certainly is worthwhile considering. While we can look at it as frozen in time today, what is going to happen to that movement and many of its followers once the charisma of Fethullah Gülen is removed from the stage? And that's something that he's not going to be extradited. I mean, the more Turkey talks about extraditing him, the more ridiculous the leadership of Turkey looks in American eyes, whether you're a supporter of Fethullah Gülen or, frankly, like me, a critic of Fethullah Gülen. So ultimately, I think there's some unknowns out there, but these are some of the discussions which I welcome the question, and some of the discussions I think we need to have much more openly, including with followers of Fethullah Gülen.
We do have another question from Professor Atalay.
It's a comment, but I think I can make it into a question. It's about, obviously, we have an election coming up here in the United States, and how it goes will affect the rest of the world. Now, in the past, we've had some policies where we've supported Islamic movements to serve as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. There was a white paper written in the 1980s. I think a few years ago we had Oktay Ekşi, a parliamentarian from Turkey, a former journalist with the credibility of a Walter Cronkite of Turkey, who gave a speech. He wrote it in Turkish, and my good friend İlknur Boray translated it into English. And then I worked with the parliamentarian to get the pronunciation correct. He was nervous about that. One thing he said was that there was a white paper written in which the U.S. Should be well advised to support movements, the Chechens, the Al-Qaeda, not the Al-Qaeda, Taliban, etc. And this backfired. It backfired because it created the Chechens. It created what happened, not in Iran, but certainly with the Taliban, and eventually Arab Spring. So what happens in the next round? Shouldn't we be careful about who we support in the name of democracy if the regime that comes into power has its first instinct to kill democracy as we know it? Please.
If I may, I mean, this is the old question. There's a couple different issues which I'll tackle. Number one, what you're basically voicing is the old question about which is more important, democracy in the process or democracy as the result. And what we oftentimes see, if you emphasize democracy in the process, you don't get democracy as the result. I mean, perhaps one of Erdogan's managerial strengths was he was much more focused on democracy as the result. And had he focused entirely on democracy in the process, I don't think Turkey would have gotten to the stage that it got. With regard to political Islamism, let me just say bluntly, Turkey is not anyone's petri dish, and it shouldn't be treated like an experiment. And the United States has made a mistake. At least some retired diplomats who have now, according to letters published online and in the Washington Post, they've come around. But the idea that they had identified someone and based on his rhetoric, believed that he was truly some new form of Islamic Democrat is mistaken and counterproductive. Whenever you put any adjective in front of Democrat, it necessarily erodes the meaning of Democrat. And you shouldn't need to constrain. I'll just take Democrat. I don't want a Jewish Democrat, a Christian Democrat, an Islamic Democrat. Once you start trying to impose other variables on that, it backfires. Historically, I'll quibble a little bit with the Taliban because the Taliban were, we supported the Mujahideen. Right. And in many ways, Afghanistan's a landlocked country. I'm being too much of a historian. The problem goes back to Bangladesh's independence in 1971, where the Pakistani General Staff learned the lesson that ethnic identity could pose an existential threat to Pakistan, and so made a conscious effort to do the exact opposite of what the Turkish General Staff had traditionally done. The Pakistani General Staff made a conscious effort to promote Islamism as the variable, as the identity which would hold people together. Now, because Afghanistan was landlocked at the time of the Soviet invasion, the deal basically was Saudi Arabia provided the money, the Americans provided the weaponry, but the Pakistanis insisted on delivering it, and they delivered it exclusively to the Peshawar 7, including people like Ahmad Shah Massoud and others who form the government now. Now, very briefly, we supported good people among the Mujahideen. We supported bad people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But the Taliban were 4 years old at the time of the Soviet invasion. And say what you will about the CIA, I'm not sure they're in the habit of training kindergartners. So ultimately, what I blame for the Taliban is Pakistan. And I don't think we can remove that accountability. What I worry about with Turkey, and this is another issue, every country that thought that, not country, every regime which thought that they could channel the forces of Islamism and use them, make a devil's bargain in which they would stay safe at home while they encouraged radicalism abroad, ended up suffering great blowback. Saudi Arabia, of course. Forget 9/11. They were struck by, they didn't become serious at 9/11. They became serious in 2003 and 2004 when Al-Qaeda started striking in Riyadh. Pakistan became more serious. They're still not very serious when the Pakistani Taliban started marching within 60 miles of Islamabad. Syria. I mean, we can think of Bashar al-Assad as some secularist. He's not. If you look at the documents captured during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Sinjar documents, Syria was the underground railroad for suicide bombers going into Iraq, and they were all paying Assad's regime protection money. What I'm worried about, and then of course, that blew back into Syria. What I'm worried about is Erdogan's flirtation with Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State is going to lead not only a generational problem with regard to education in Turkey, but a generational security problem in which thousands of innocent people are going to be killed before that blowback is eradicated.
Yeah. We're just about out of time. We have to clear out of the auditorium by 4:30, I was told. But Sean Faircloth's book is on sale and available for signing outside. I think everybody is invited to the Evelar's house for a reception and wine and cheese. I'm very grateful for to all three of you for appearing here and bringing us all this wisdom. And Barack, do you have any final words? Or?
Let's get a picture also. Sure.
Thank you very much. That was a very insightful debate of ideas and theories and possibilities. And I still have questions, but we have more time thereafter, so I'll pick your brains later. Thank you very much.
Maybe I could just add one point. A gentleman early on, when he was talking about the Danbury letter, most of you probably know this, but in the letter that Jefferson wrote to Danbury, it was, ironically, from today's perspective, to Baptists who, at that time in New England, were an oppressed minority from the Congregationalists or the descendants of the Pilgrims, who were pretty strict and theocratic in the way they ran things in New England. And the Baptists were the ones worried. Nowadays, of course, in American politics, a lot of times the Baptists are the ones who want to have church and state intertwined. And so going back to our foreign policy, at least for me, I think in the end we have to stick with the principle that we're protecting minority rights by keeping separation of church and state, and to be wary of supporting entities, kind of like you're saying about Islamic democracy, where they're saying, we're going to split the difference. America first started with that principle of separation of church and state, and to the degree we adhere to it, we are true to ourselves, and I think in the long run, have a wise foreign policy, so that actually being idealistic in this case may in the long run be the most pragmatic.
Thank you again.